You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Welcome back to On the Way Home, the podcast where we explore the ideas, people, and solutions shaping the future of housing and community. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly. Today, I'm joined by Brian Doucet, urban geographer, researcher, and one of the leading voices challenging how we think about housing systems in Canada and beyond. Brian's work pushes us to look beyond simple supply narratives and to consider affordability, displacement, preservation, and the broader systems that shape how communities grow and change. Let's jump in. Brian, thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
My pleasure, Emily. Thanks for having me.
We always start this show with our signature question: what does home mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great way to start. And I think for me, home is shelter. It's where my family is. I'm sort of speaking personally for me. Home is for me a place where I feel safe. I know that's not always the case for everybody. But home for me is sort of my space, right? And I, or my space with my family, and it's that's very special. Of course, one of the challenges is that is not the case for everybody in this country, and that is becoming harder and harder. And so I think this idea of home as a safe space, as everyone should have the right to have that space. That is something that, as a country, we have to work really hard at, and we've always had to work really hard at. But I think we have to also change our thinking a little bit about how do we achieve that. And I think for a long time, we have not really thought collectively, or we've not really thought as a society, how do we achieve that for everyone? We've sort of thought this is individual, an individual path that people pursue, or that it's done, in the name of making money, and that provides places for people to live. And I think if we want housing to be something that everyone can feel safe and secure in, we really need to change our thinking about how we achieve that.
Absolutely. And we know that solving the housing crisis isn't just about building more market housing. I'm wondering if you can break down for all of us what Canada has gotten wrong about the just build more approach and what's been missing from that conversation.
Yeah, and it's not just Canada. This is a conversation that happens in countries around the world. And for the last 30 or 40 years, we have got into a situation, not just in housing, but in a lot of other areas of our society, where we defer to the market. The market, if it's enabled to do more, will solve this. And the market is actually quite good at building housing. It can build it quite quickly. It can build it on a good scale. The challenge is that we've been so fixated on this idea of supply and numbers, and not really focusing on the question of what kind of housing and for whom. So while the market will build a lot of houses, they're not necessarily the kinds of houses in the locations and at price points that millions of Canadians need, right? The market is very good at building very small condo units, usually, but not exclusively, in sort of core urban areas that are popular with investors, right? Because that other aspect of what does housing mean? I mean, for some people, housing is a source of wealth. It's a speculative commodity from which to make money. The market is actually quite good when times are good at providing that investment product. And if you look across the country, the vast majority of condo units built since 2016 are bought by investors, or to put it another way, bought by people who already have somewhere else to live. Right? So the market is good at doing that. It's also good at building pretty big houses on the edges of cities that, your 3,000 square foot houses that, again, some people can afford, but a lot cannot. And so it's everything in between that actually we haven't done a good job of building, because to some extent we have sort of stopped as a society prioritizing housing, right? We had years in the late 90s and 2000s in cities like Toronto where no new social housing was built, like none. And that's not how you have a housing system that provides shelter for everybody.
So, in your film, Thinking Beyond the Market, you explore genuinely affordable housing. What does non market housing actually mean in practice, and why is it so important right now?
That's a great question. And I think one of the things I want to try and do with the film is really just capture this idea that non-market housing can be so much, right? A broad definition that we use in the film is any kind of housing that is protected from market forces, thereby offering affordability in perpetuity. So we're not talking about something that's going to be affordable for 10 years or 15 years or 25 years. Um, and that is much more than social housing. That's an important part of it, but non-market housing can include a whole range of rental and even ownership schemes that work to decommodify housing and work to take some of that speculation and that profit out of housing. So that involves governments, that involves nonprofits, that can involve faith-based groups, and a whole range of housing. Because again, if you think of the kind of housing that the market is delivering and the segments of society that that doesn't cater for. That is a huge laneway, a huge runway for the non-market sector to say, okay, we are going to provide this kind of housing. And that can be everything from, there are teachers and nurses in many communities across the country that cannot afford what the market is providing. And so we also need to think non-market housing about how do we provide housing for people who need to live in places, who want to live in places. But the supply that we have, even if we scaled up that supply and kept building more of it, that supply is not going to deliver the kind of housing that millions of Canadians need.
There's a lot of talk about building new housing, but not as much about protecting what already exists.
Yeah.
Why is preserving existing affordable housing just as critical as creating new supply?
Well, yeah, I mean, Steve Pomeroy, who's in the film, has done some analysis on this, and the numbers do vary. But generally, even if we're looking at a conservative number, if we look at the number of new, genuinely affordable non-market units that are coming online, and the number of existing affordable housing, now these are mostly through the market, mostly private sector, the number of those housing units that we are losing, it's generally like, I don't know, 10 to 1, 15 to 1. It depends, where you draw the line and where you look. But, for every new unit of affordable housing that we're celebrating, we're losing 10, 12, 15 basically through the back door. And we're losing them sometimes because they're demolished. I mean, that sometimes happens. So there are mechanisms that places in Canada are already doing to try and ensure that if those units are demolished, and you demolish a 3-story older walk-up apartment, you build a 20-story building. There are places like Burnaby that have rules in place that say, okay, you have to replace those units, right? And replace them for the people who are there, and also grow that affordable sector within those new developments. But a lot of it simply happens with tenant churn, right? There's this idea that tenants move because in many provinces, Ontario included, there are rent control rules for sitting tenants. So if you are a tenant, you've lived in a building, and the unit is first occupied before the 15th of November 2018, that's the cutoff. New units that have come online since then have no rent control whatsoever. But if you're living in an older building, you benefit from rent control. So the province sets the guideline increase of 2%, 3%, 1%, whatever, and that is what your rent is subject to rise per year. And that works for sitting tenants. The problem is when the tenant leaves, there's no rent control mechanism that keeps that rent rise the same for the new tenant coming in. So this creates a huge incentive for landlords to kick out long-term sitting tenants. So that if someone was paying, say, $1,200 a month because they've been living in a place for a long time, market rent might be $2,000 or $2,500. If you can remove that tenant, you can actually then, for the new tenant, set the rate at $2,000 or $2,500. And so this creates, I mean, the relationship between landlords and tenants is already one of the most unequal relationships that we have in our society. And then you create this incentive to kick out these long-term tenants. And all of a sudden, these units that were more affordable because the rent is increasing with the guideline does this massive jump. And then for the new tenant after that, it's still subject to the same guideline increases. But then you lose a unit that might be renting for $1,000 a month or less. And then it becomes a much more expensive unit. And that's happening all across the country. We've done research here at the University of Waterloo with partners across Ontario and the Social Planning Network of Ontario and social development centers, really looking at what this means for tenants. And this creates a really, really unpleasant atmosphere because, again, you see the dollar signs of having you out and having a new tenant in, and it really creates a situation where we actually call it displacement by exhaustion. A lot of the work that we've done really engaging with tenants who've been displaced, very, very few cases actually go to a tribunal and are enforced by courts. Most of it is much more informal or semi-formal. And this kind of approach of, the landlord will offer a few $1,000 to leave voluntarily, right? Or will harass or intimidate tenants, will print off an eviction notice and then give it to the tenants. And for a lot of tenants who maybe don't know their rights, don't speak the language so well, what have you, are too busy, they can see the landlord wants them out. For most tenants who are faced with that situation, that is enough for them to leave. And it's important to stress that none of that actually shows up in statistics, because this is that relationship between landlords and tenants. And if anything, it shows up as a voluntary move, right? I'll give you $5,000 if you sign this notice to end your tenancy voluntarily. And what we would argue is that these things that might appear as voluntary moves are in fact anything but. And what happens then is that those units remain, but they're much more expensive. And so if we had a mechanism, even just temporarily, if we can't, collectively stomach the idea of having, full rent control, even temporarily, if we had this, we need to keep rents in check. We need to stop them rising. We need to stop this erosion of housing that is affordable to folks on lower incomes. That would go a long way to dealing with the housing crisis, particularly for low and moderate income households and for tenants, but also towards essentially closing the door of homelessness, or closing one of the doors, right? Because what's happening with a lot of folks is they get evicted because a landlord wants to raise the rent. They face a rent eviction or a displacement like this. And then there's not a whole lot of other steps beyond that until homelessness. And so if we had a mechanism to stop that, or to make that much more difficult, that would help dealing with the homelessness crisis, because we would stop people falling in to homelessness, or we'd stop more people falling into homelessness. I mean, it sounds doom and gloom, but one of the things I try and convey in the film is like, this stuff isn't rocket science. And even more importantly, there are places that actually are doing this and have managed to come up with mechanisms, either with full rent control or in lieu of full rent control, mechanisms that help stop and curb those unjust rent evictions.
I'm just going to throw in, for listeners who haven't seen your film, I loved that piece in there where you really brought it back to the individual being impacted by legislation or by actions like this. And there was a woman who was basically being rent evicted, and she said, how it's so easy when we're walking the streets to pass judgment on people experiencing homelessness or addictions or things like that. And she was herself saying, like, when I'm out on the streets shortly, like, I don't know to what end, what coping mechanisms you have to employ basically to survive the streets, which was really sad to see. And the end of the story was that she did actually get evicted, which was incredibly heart-wrenching, and to your point, probably happens way more than we display in the data.
Absolutely. And that segment of the film, which was done with the help of Acorn Hamilton, who's done some great work around tenants' rights and tenant organizing. I mean, that was done informed by the research that we did across Ontario with the Social Planning Network of Ontario, right? Hearing these stories, hearing individual testimonials or individual, what you might call anecdotes. But then when you hear enough of them, you see the patterns and the trends, and you see that this is widespread. And as you say, Emily, like so much of this just falls under the radar, right? Like most, not all, but most elected officials, chief policymakers, chief planners in communities across the country do not face rent evictions. Not all, some do. And those that do understand, they have that lived expertise, that lived experience. But one of the things, I'm a planning professor, and planning is about the process of how plans are made, how decisions are made. And one of the key aspects of that, and this is something I stress with my students, and it's certainly something I try and do with my work, and it certainly informed the film. One of the key aspects of that is deciding who is part of those decision making. Which voices do you listen? Which voices do you go out of your way to try to incorporate? Doesn't mean you can build everything from what everyone's saying into plans, but it's how you prioritize different voices. And I think places, again, coming back to solutions, the places that are at the forefront of implementing good policymaking and good solutions are incorporating through a variety of ways that lived experience and that lived expertise. Because if you speak to folks who have been displaced, one of the first things they will tell you is we need better rent control, we need better tenant protection, right? And again, this isn't rocket science. And if those voices are heard and centered within discussions, then we actually see some really important policies, bylaws, legislation coming into effect.
You've studied housing systems in both Canada and the Netherlands. What lessons from the Dutch approach do you think Canada could realistically adopt?
Oh, that's a good question. It's been a while since I've studied housing in the Netherlands. I lived there between 2004 and 2017. I did my master's and PhD there, and then I ended up working at ultimately 2 universities for another better part of a decade. And I studied gentrification and neighborhood change. And when I was there and when I was studying, I would say it was not the place to go for inspiration. Like if you had gone to Amsterdam or Dutch cities in the 1990s, you would have seen a very different situation. You would have seen a situation, and we had, if you go back to Canadian cities in the 70s and 80s, it would have been similar, not to the same scale, but you would have seen the prioritization of social housing in key urban districts. So I took students around Amsterdam, right in the middle of the city, looking at areas that had been redeveloped in the 80s and 90s that were almost all social housing. Very inexpensive, and social housing in the Netherlands, a much greater share of the population lives in social housing, and it goes back over 100 years, but you have these independent housing corporations, woningcorporaties, they call them in Dutch, that provided this social housing. A whole bunch of things changed, but up until about 30 odd years ago, yes, you saw this prioritization of social housing. So you'd get, things like the St. Lawrence neighborhood that we have in Toronto. Again, that's our shining light of when we prioritized affordable housing and non-market housing all over Dutch cities. And what happened after that, again, this idea of the market, we want the market to play more of a role. The market's going to provide the kinds of housing that we need. There were, the title of my dissertation was Rich Cities with Poor People. And that came from a quote from someone I spoke to in the municipality of Rotterdam, who basically said, the problem with Rotterdam is that we're a rich city with poor people. And what he meant by that was, we have a lot of social housing. We have too much social housing, and we want to encourage more middle class people to come in to our city. And so Rotterdam actually had a policy um, going back about 15 years where they wanted to reduce the percentage of social housing by 1% per year. And at the time, it was over 50% of the housing stock was social housing. So when I was there was actually this push towards, quote unquote, diversifying housing by trying to bring in more affluent residents in all cities, Amsterdam as well, and sort of residualizing social housing. I think what's happened since is that, again, the housing crisis is affecting more and more people. Housing costs are rising. The market hasn't provided housing at price points that regular folks can afford. And so there has been a bit of a pushback on that. And there are some voices now calling for, bringing back greater percentages of social housing into new housing projects. But I think we have to be careful when we look at other places. And I spent 13 years in the Netherlands. I studied housing there and was familiar with other European countries as well. But I don't mention that in the film because I think in some ways, sometimes just looking at another place is almost like the easy answer. Like Vienna has probably among the best social housing systems and policies in the world. And so lots of people look to Vienna. And what I've read and what I understand about Vienna is it's not perfect, but it's pretty good, right? And it's a lot better than what we have here. And so there are people who would say, let's just do like Vienna does. We can't go back 100 years and start a municipal housing corporation that builds housing all across the city so that we have this great stock of non-market housing. We can't replicate the national policies, the broader politics and political economic context that produces the outcomes that we see today in countries that we look to and we think they're doing great things. So we can look for some inspiration, we can look for some ideas, but if we really wanted to say replicate something like Vienna, you know what the best thing we could do is today or tomorrow? Start a municipal housing corporation and look at all the public land that we have in that municipality and do something fundamentally different with it. That would be the insight from Vienna of saying, hey, a municipality has assets, it has land, it should get into the business of doing something itself. Maybe we create that with a range of different housing types, so we have different revenues, we're serving different markets. Like, that is the lesson from some of these places that seem to be today doing housing well. We can't go back in time, but what we can do is say, we are going to be proactive. We're going to take that political will. We're going to take the bull by the horns and actually create an entity ourselves that is going to provide housing that currently the market's not providing.
Wow, a lot to think about there. We hear a lot about gentrification and displacement. It can feel abstract, and I know this is taking us back a bit to people who aren't directly affected. Maybe could you share with us a bit more what displacement actually looks like on the ground for real families and communities?
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate that has never happened to me, so I can't really speak from personal experience. So, I mean, the best way to get detailed answers around that is to speak with folks who have that experience and who have that knowledge and that expertise. What we have done here over many years is work with a number of partners who do work on those front lines, helping people stop being displaced and evicted. And again, assembling those stories and assembling that knowledge and working with those groups and working with those individuals to meaningfully and respectfully tell those stories that help to render visible a process that is really I mean, I think it's more visible now because many of us have been talking about it. But up until a few years ago, a process that was really quite invisible, right? Like I have heard stories of folks who are on ODSP, right, or Ontario Works, who would have that rent, and this is with a private landlord, would have that rent come off their ODSP check and go directly into the landlord's bank account. And I remember hearing one story from an individual who said a new landlord, new property manager came in. This is often how things start with rent evictions, right? The building changes hands. It's often a financialized landlord, a corporate landlord, who bring in their own staff to help administer all the rents. So the first change that happened was, we're not going to take it off the ODSP. You have to give us a check or transfer it into our bank account. And what happened was, this individual would get his ODSP, he would write a check, give it to the landlord, but the check wouldn't be cashed until the end of the month. And what happens when you're on very low income is, well, you think that money is just cleared out of your bank account. But what happens if you've spent more during that month and then the landlord waits until the end of the month to cash the check? Well, it doesn't take very long before that check bounces. And then enough of that happens enough times, that is legal cause to evict you, to kick you out. So again, it comes back to, statistically, that would appear like an at-fault eviction. But when you dig a little deeper, you realize that it is more complicated than that, to say the least.
You've said that many solutions to the housing crisis are already happening in Canada. Can you share a few examples of initiatives or models that are working, and perhaps why they're not more widely known?
Yeah, so the idea, and the film chronicles a number of things, and a lot of it revolves around land and public land, because publicly owned land, or land that is outside the realm of speculation, outside the realm of the markets. This could be land that's owned by a nonprofit, land that's owned by a religious group, faith-based group, what have you. The thing that they don't always tell you is, if you own a piece of land, you can kind of set the rules, in a sense, right? If I own a piece of land and I want to build an apartment building, I can put rent control in, right? I can do it. The rules don't say you cannot put rent control in at all. What the rules basically say is, you don't have to put rent control in. Now, private developers do not put rent control on their new apartments, because that reduces the amount of rent they will make and ultimately reduces their profit and changes the dynamic of how much they would pay for the land and so on. But if I wanted to just build an apartment building on a piece of land that I owned, as long as it fit with the zoning, sure, I can put in whatever kind of rents that I want to put in. So when you realize that, and you realize that municipalities in particular own quite a lot of land within their boundaries, and a lot of that land can be used to develop housing. And the one that I always like to come to is municipally owned surface parking lots. They're everywhere, right? And so to your listeners and viewers, like, the next time you're walking around, driving around your town, look at a parking lot that is owned by your municipality. It probably isn't full. Most of the time they're not. And imagine what that could be. Imagine that as a 5-story, 3-story, 10-story, 20-story, whatever, depending on the context, all non-market, a variety of types of affordable housing, a variety of types of rent, maybe even some ownership. Whistler Housing Authority has an ownership scheme where the buying and selling is pegged to inflation. So you can buy a 2-bedroom condo in Whistler for $250,000. At least you could when we did the filming a couple years ago. The trick is, you're going to sell it for $250,000 plus inflation. Now you pay that mortgage down. You have an asset that's worth whatever, $275,000 in 10 years from now. So you're not going to get the same price appreciation as you would in the market, but you're going to have a place to live. Coming back to my original idea of what home means, you're going to have a place that you know you can be secure in, that you actually own. that can be your safe space, your space. You're not going to get rich from buying and selling it, but you can live there as long as you want. And Whistler Housing Authority, I would love for every municipality across the country to have something like that and take their assets and do something fundamentally different than what the market is doing. And when I say that, that introduces a whole range of possibility. The key is that it is fundamentally different than the kind of supply that the market is building. I mean, you could have a municipality that could say tomorrow, we've got this parking lot, it's zoned for 10 stories, we're going to lease it. We want 50% to be rent geared to income, and we want the other 50% to be average market rent. And let's be clear, the average market rent that what everyone pays is still a lot cheaper than the available market rent. If you go on to rentals.ca or something, the available rent's going to be much more expensive. So even something at average market rent is going to fill a need. And yeah, those units at average market rent are going to rise with the rent control guideline increase. And set out that as a call for proposals and see what comes up. You'll probably get some developers, some nonprofits, maybe working together. I think a lot becomes possible when we start to unlock that idea of using public land differently. And the absolute worst thing that a municipality or a public entity can do is sell that vacant piece of land, sell that surface parking lot in the downtown of your community, sell it on the open market to the highest bidder. That is the worst thing that a municipality or a government agency could do, because yeah, you're going to get more supply, but you're going to get more of the same. And we can't keep building more of the same, because we've done actually a pretty good job of building more of the same for many, many years, and it hasn't made housing more affordable. We have to build different kinds of housing. One of the things I want to do with this film, the film does talk about land quite a bit and many examples that take place on land that's publicly owned, often in partnerships with different groups, with nonprofits, sometimes with developers, with Canada Lands, which is the federal government's real estate arm to dispose of surplus real estate, with Indigenous nations partnering together. All sorts of things are possible. But the worst thing, like with this film, I want to make it, I would love to change the conversation, Emmy, to make it political suicide for a politician to suggest, let's take this piece of land and sell it to a developer on the open market. I want that to be so taboo, because once that land is gone, it's gone. Right? And that's some of the narrative that I'm hoping to change. And the places that understand that, I mean, I live in Kitchener. Kitchener's approach to public land has changed substantially over the last 5-7 years. Whistler, again, very good example of that. There are places that understand it. There are places that are starting to change, and we need to have that conversation nationally.
Taking us off a bit here, but in practice, how much would you say should be owned then by municipalities? Like, what would it take also to kind of reverse some, like, do we need to reverse some of what's already happened? Like, do municipalities need to buy from private and so on?
Yeah, I mean, coming back to your earlier point about protecting existing supply, I mean, I think we need to be more aggressive in trying to acquire existing properties, existing private market properties, and bring them into public or non-market ownership. Montreal has a right of first refusal policy that was given to it by the provincial government. So it has identified about 300 properties in the city, largely in areas that are gentrifying, right? So these are older apartments in areas that are seeing more investment. They're seeing rents rise. They're seeing a lot of change happening. And when those units come up for sale, and when there's an agreement between a buyer and a seller, the city can step in and say, okay, you've agreed to pay $10 million for this building. We are going to buy it for $10 million. And so they have done that in a few instances. And then with that, they can do a number of things. They can keep that building in public ownership themselves. They can lease it to a nonprofit. They could even redevelop it, right? Like we always talk about upzoning and adding density. One of the great ideas that we need to really explore more of is, are there government-owned sites or nonprofit-owned sites that are maybe at lower density, older buildings? Can we actually demolish those and build more non-market housing on those same sites, right? Like an old 3-story, social housing. Can we build 15 stories of non-market housing on that site? That is, I think, one of the, the aspirations that we need to really be thinking about. In terms of numbers, I mean, I think if we were delivering about 20% of our new supply being non-market, and that is a range, as we've talked about, a range of um, types, owned by governments, owned by nonprofits, owned by faith-based groups, right? Like Indwell here in southwestern Ontario does a lot of really, really innovative stuff around deeply affordable housing, but also non-market housing that rents at different price points. I think we also need to think about, yes, we need affordable housing that is at a third of people's income or 30% of people's income, right? Rent geared to income. We need housing at those low rents. We do need that. I'm personally not a big believer in rent freezes. I think rents do need to rise, costs rise, and you do need to have, as a housing provider, revenue growth that keeps pace with the cost of other things that you have to do to maintain those units. But I think we need a lot of those deeply affordable units. But a nonprofit, whether that be a municipality or a nonprofit organization that is only providing deeply, deeply affordable units, is very soon going to run into challenges in funding their operations and going to have to rely on huge subsidies. So if we want to grow this sector, one thinking is, well, can that nonprofit that wants to provide deeply affordable housing, that's their core mission, can they support their core mission and grow their core mission if they're also renting out units at slightly higher rents, again, serving that segment of the population that's not being served, to generate more revenue to help subsidize the deeply affordable so that they can be more self-sustaining? And if we want the non-market sector to grow and to be a serious force, we have to be thinking in those terms. We have to be thinking about how we have, first of all, expanding this idea of what non-market housing encompasses. And again, there are places that do that. Whistler Housing Authority, great example, right? Can some of that be used to help grow and maintain the deeply affordable stuff, because the operating subsidies often aren't there and aren't enough? And this is a huge potential. If we wanted to grow this sector to 20% of new supply, we have to be thinking in those terms. And I think if we were able to, in a relatively few number of years, be in a situation where 20% of the housing supply that we were adding was non-market in a variety of ways, I think we would be on a pathway to delivering very different outcomes than we have now.
Absolutely. And just on that 20%, would you say that would be the target of all housing? So, like, truthfully, we have to be building or creating at a higher rate than 20% to reach that target? Or, I mean, obviously, starting with new 20% is great. Do we need to look at what's already out there as well to increase that percentage?
Well, as we've talked about before, the idea of protecting existing supply is important. And if we have ways to bring some of that into public or non-market ownership, and again, we're not going to get to a situation like Sweden has, or like the Netherlands has. The Netherlands still has a very, I don't know what the exact percentage is of social housing as the overall housing supply, but it's certainly in that 20% range, if not higher. We're not going to get to that in the foreseeable future of the overall stock, unless we do something completely radical, which I don't think there's an appetite to do here. You look at the countries that have that kind of percentage of non-market housing, and they've done that for, they've been 50 years, 100 years more. So I think in the absence of that, having strong tenant protections, ensuring tenants' rights are clear, are strong, and are enforced. That's a really big aspect. That can help protect tenants that are in the private sector. And the reality in Canada is, for the foreseeable future, the vast majority of our new housing supply is going to be delivered by the market, whether that be ownership or rental. So we can do a better job of trying to regulate and shape that supply so that the options for people are more, right? Like, it would be nice to be able to rent a nice apartment in a new building and know that your rent is going to stay stable and rise basically with inflation. It would be nice to have some more protections so that you have a little bit more say. You can paint the walls of your apartment. You can put up posters, like pictures and things, like many other countries do, to give that security of tenure in the rental system, right? Because home ownership is going to be increasingly out of reach for more and more Canadians. So we also want to make rental housing more appealing, and having that security of home that we talked about at the outset, having that security. I know I can stay here for 5 years, and I know I can plan and budget for that my rent's not going to double, which it could, with units built after 15th of November 2018 here in Ontario, because there's no rent control on it. If we had more of that security, more of those regulations in the private sector, I think that would create a better sense of home for more people, and would help alleviate some of the insecurities that lots of tenants face.
How do transportation and neighborhood change factor into housing affordability? Like, why can't we talk about housing without talking about transit and city planning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually have a new research project that we're just getting started now, that's really looking from the tenant perspectives along some of these new rapid transit corridors, about what the challenges they're facing, and importantly, what are the solutions that they would like to see brought to the table. Um, I think one of the biggest urban challenges that we face in cities across the country is, how do we build and maintain? And as we've talked throughout this episode, building and maintaining, both important, requires two different sets of tools. How do we build and maintain affordable housing near good transit? We're very slow at building transit. I think everyone in the GTA knows that, but we are building more transit. We are expanding higher order transit. I live in Waterloo, Kitchener-Waterloo. We have a 19-kilometer light rail line that opened in 2019 that's completely transformed the region. So we're building this transit, and we're good at building housing near it, right? There's something like $5 billion worth of investment along this light rail corridor here in Waterloo region. Now, most of that is residential, and almost all of that is condos. And the vast majority of those condos are bought by investors. So we're very good at changing rules and zoning to enable development to take place near transit. And we're very good, actually, and we're very proactive. Because if you look across the country, a lot of new transit infrastructure, yes, it is meant to move people. That's what transit does. But it's also part of shaping the growth trajectory of communities, shaping where growth takes place. So in Waterloo, it was very, very clear the region did not want to continue to sprawl, right? We have all around Waterloo region, we have productive agricultural areas that are culturally significant for the region. And the region was seeing that over the decades after World War II, it was just growing and growing and growing and flopping out into these rural areas, and it didn't want to do that. And so it created this growth boundary area, which is kind of like the stick, so to speak. But it also funded and created the light rail line, which was the carrot to entice development into the existing urban core. And in that regard, it's been hugely successful in getting new development and actually reshaping. So you go back 15 years, about 2/3 of the new growth within Waterloo region was on greenfield sites, pushing the urban boundary outward. Now we're in a case where that's flipped. About 2/3, it's definitely the majority of new growth, is taking place within the existing urban footprint. And the light rail system has a big part to play with that. So you can say very clearly, we as a society, and certainly here in Waterloo region, we've been very proactive in shaping where growth takes place. Like, that's not left to the market. There's a lot of planning and shaping and guiding through infrastructure that has created those patterns of where growth takes place. But we still very much leave the question of what kind of growth and for whom to the market. And this is a shortcoming, I think. This is something where we have to have much more attention and be much more proactive. So I think we need much stronger rules around inclusionary zoning, which is regulating that a certain percentage of units need to be quote unquote affordable. So we need to be much more proactive about having stronger rules around inclusionary zoning, particularly around transit stations. Right now in Ontario, the only inclusionary zoning that the province has allowed is around major transit station areas. So subway stops, GO stations, light rail, and so on. 5% of units for 25 years at 80% of market rate. I mean, that's a nothing, really. That's a drop. It's not nothing, but it's a drop in the bucket of what is needed. You go somewhere like Burnaby in British Columbia. Burnaby had the same challenges around its SkyTrain stations, the metro light metro system in Greater Vancouver. It had a lot of 1950s apartment buildings, 2 or 3 story walk-ups, right? Older buildings that were reaching the end of their life, so to speak, but were also quite affordable. So provided that market-based housing at rents that lower income folks could afford. Well, what was happening around those stations was all this redevelopment was taking place. And so these buildings were being knocked down, residents were being kicked out. So you're on your own, go find some other place. And in place of those 2 or 3 or 4 story buildings, developers were putting 20, 30, 40 story towers. And from a planning perspective, right, this makes a lot of sense, right? From the where growth takes place, right? BC, Metro Vancouver has very finite land, so it is growing upward. It's around transit stations, it's adding density, like it ticks all these boxes. But until Burnaby Council stepped in, it wasn't addressing that housing for whom question. And so about 6 or 7 years ago, the city introduced 2 policies, a rental use zoning policy, which basically enabled them to zone all existing rental land. So if you have an apartment building, it's rental, you could zone that for rental. So if it was redeveloped, they also had to build rental. So that was one. And within that, they put in rules to say that 20% of the units have to be affordable, with a much better definition of affordable than we have in Ontario. It's about 40% below market. So some of those are the replacement units. So let's do some basic math. You're tearing down a 10 story or 10 unit building and you're building a 100 unit building. With the 20%, you'd have 20 affordable units. 10 would be replacement units for the people who were displaced temporarily for the construction, and 10 would be additional units that were affordable. And then they also implemented something called the tenant assistance policy, which I think is the best tenant protection rules in Canada, one of the best in the world, I would argue, where they say, okay, this is going to happen. We know this is going to happen. We actually want this to happen. But we need to make sure that tenants have a place to stay when they are displaced and can come back at the same rent. So the tenant assistance policy ensures that the landlord, the developer, the rezoning applicant, whoever it is, pays moving costs for the tenant twice, right? You got to move out to a temporary accommodation and you got to move back. They have to find accommodate, or they are tasked with finding accommodation. So if they have a big portfolio, okay, here's another unit in another building nearby, you can rent there at the same rent while we're redeveloping your site. There's also, I think, options where they provide the same rent amount or something like that, where if tenants find something on their own, they're not basically the tenants are not unduly financially burdened. So the developer, I think, pays the top up of the difference if they're finding something more expensive while they're building is being redeveloped. Like that's what it is. And then they get to come back to one of those units in the new building for basically the same price they were paying in the old one plus inflation. So I've taken time to explain this because I think it is so important for a couple of reasons. One, this has not slowed down development in Burnaby. I mean, I think everywhere is now slower, but while things were booming everywhere, Burnaby was also booming. The sky did not fall in. Burnaby surpassed City of Vancouver in terms of apartment starts with these two policies in place. Vancouver's a much bigger city than Burnaby in terms of population. Developers got to build more, right? They got extra density with this. So they were getting about 10 stories on every tower, which again, you're factoring in those extra 10 stories, 20% are going to be affordable. So it's win-win. Burnaby saw new private-based development with this 20%. It saw new non-market development as well. And so it has been a success in many ways. And I highlight it because, like, if every community in the country had this, had clear rules in place, had more ambitious targets for, let's not even call it affordable housing, let's call it building housing that we actually need, right? We don't need, and again, they're not all sitting empty, but if you poll housing experts and you say, what is the greatest need for housing around transit stations? I think very low on that list is going to be 500 square foot units that are bought by investors. Like, sure, we need some small units for demographics, but we need a range of options. And we're not being ambitious in providing the kind of choice that Canadians need around transit infrastructure.
Brian, this has been such a good conversation, and we're almost at time, and I feel like we could have had much longer with you. It's so interesting and so much knowledge there. Before we end, I do want to ask, for people who feel overwhelmed by the scale of the housing crisis right now, what is one concrete thing, big or small, that governments, communities, everyday residents, our listeners can push for to make a real difference?
Great question. And it's something that comes up a lot in Q&As after the film. I would say for a municipality, find a piece of land that you own. You already own it. You don't need to buy it. You don't need to acquire it. Ideally, a surface parking lot. And put out a proposal to work with a variety of partners, including nonprofits, to do something fundamentally different with that site than what the market is delivering and the kind of supply that you have in your community. So again, even if it's just, we want to build a new apartment building, but we want to put rent control on it. Even that would be fundamentally different. Right? That would be very different than new rental supply coming online. So try it. Try something. If you don't want to start your municipal housing corporation today, try doing some unique partnership, some lease, long-term lease, low-cost lease with a nonprofit to do something fundamentally different. That would be step one. For individuals, talk to folks. If you're a renter, talk to your neighbors, talk to your fellow tenants. Make sure you know your rights. Make sure your neighbors know their rights. You want to do more than that? There are lots of organizations that are working to help tenants. Talk to your local Acorn chapter. Get in touch with your social planning council. Vote is another big one, right? Statistically, homeowners vote more than renters. If that was different, that might put some of these tenant rights issues more on the agenda. But most importantly, just talk and engage and work with others. Often as individuals, we feel this is a very kind of solitary challenge. Often as municipalities, I've gone to many, many places and screen this film in many communities. And most communities say, our community is unique. We've got these challenges. We've got these issues. And I guarantee you, they are very similar to what every municipality across the country is dealing with. And as as someone working on those front lines, like in planning, in homeless prevention, in frontline services, in advocacy in your community, it can be very difficult to see the bigger picture, right? Like I've had conversations with folks that I've worked with very, for a long time here in Waterloo region, and I can tell them that the work that we have done here over the years in rendering visible things like displacement and rent evictions has led to policy changes. And I can point to specific developments and specific policies at the regional and the local level here that have come from our work. But I have the luxury as an academic, I have the luxury of being able to see that. I'm not on the front lines all the time. And when you're dealing with the immediacy of the housing crisis, it can be very difficult to see that and to see that there are other people fighting the same fight, and linking up with them is very important, and B, that there are solutions out there. And again, I always come back to this. This is not rocket science. This is not a question of how do we think of new solutions. We do not need to think of new solutions. They are there. They are staring us in the face. They are hiding in plain sight. And in many cases across the country, they're already happening. They're happening at small scales. So how do we build? How do we get people talking? How do we get people seeing the bigger picture? To say, if every municipality had something like the Whistler Housing Authority, if we had tenant protections, rent control rules, if we had housing acquisition policies, if we had that across the country, if we were building en masse non-market housing on publicly owned land, we would have very, very different outcomes. And all of those things are happening here and there. And that's why I went across the country, right? The film is join me, the planning professor, as I go across the country. Of course, I'd already done my homework. I'd already researched these before. But the premise is I'm going to learn, quote unquote, about these things that are already happening to tell other Canadians, to tell other folks, and to normalize things that really should be happening across the country.
You heard it here. It's happening, and we can scale successful approaches across Canada. I will say for our listeners, when I watched your film, it did feel like it brought a lot of information together and really helped to crystallize. Where can our listeners find your film, Thinking Beyond the Market?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing real quick about the film. Like one of the things I want to do with the film is I want to inspire people, right? I want to get people galvanized. It is a call to action. I want to challenge people to think a little bit differently, to think about these ideas of non-market housing, public land, all these sorts of things differently. But when I go to these communities and screen the film, because right now that's sort of what we're doing, it's almost like a call to challenge particularly leaders who are maybe skeptical about things that they can do, to challenge people to tell me or to tell us, the audience of the film, why you can't do something like that as well. Explain to us why you can't take something that's already happening across the country and do it in your community. And sometimes there are provincial rules for some things, but in every community that we have showed this film and every community that we will be showing the film in, there are elements from the examples already happening coast to coast that could be implemented the next day. Usually we show it in the evening, so city hall's closed for the day, could be implemented or the process started the next day if the political will was there. And if the political will was there, you need leaders to champion ideas. You need politicians, right? You need policymakers and planners to write good bylaws and draft good rules and have good enforcement. But that's not enough. You need those folks to be pushed by communities who are organized, who vote, importantly, and who demand change. Again, I want it to be the case where if a politician suggests we are going to sell this piece of land to a developer, I want that to be shot down instantly. That's not even going to be politically feasible in the future. And that comes when communities are organized, they're educated, and they demand different things. In terms of seeing the film, at the moment, we are doing screenings. I think we are up to about 26 or 27 that we have done. Mostly in Ontario, though we have a trip to Montreal coming up next month, and we have a trip out to Alberta, in April. So mostly at the moment, it is community screenings. So if folks are really interested, and especially if they're part of an organization, best thing to do is get in touch, and we are happy to help facilitate screenings. At the moment, we are just doing that. The ambition and the aim is, the ambition is, you, in the not too distant future, you can get on your airline of choice from a Canadian airport and watch the film in flight, right? Like, that's the aspiration that we have with the film. And to get there, it would be, you can put on your TV and put on your streaming platform of choice, and you can watch it there. That's what we want to do. I think the message resonates with where we're at. I don't think we want to hear in this country more of how bad things are. I think we've heard that. I think we understand that. I think there's great books, there's great films, there's great research. I've done research to help render visible how bad things are. I think where the conversation needs and wants to go, and where I'm trying to take it with this film, is we know things are bad. What can we do about it? What can municipalities do? What can provinces do? What can the federal government do? What can nonprofits, faith-based groups, what can individuals do? And the film, I think, hopefully speaks to that moment that we're at, or we're going to get at, of here are some ideas. Here are some solutions. A lot of politicians don't really like thinking of ideas themselves. They'd like to be presented with ideas that they can champion. Here's a whole film, almost an hour and a half, of ideas that you can pick and choose from for your community. And the aim is to do as many screenings as we can in the next half a year, and we'll see what happens from there.
I feel the passion. I feel the ambition. I certainly felt the solution-focused approach from your film, kind of synthesizing all the challenges we're facing, but also sharing what the solutions are. So really excited to hear about your ambition and next steps for this film and for where we're going as a nation. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today. This conversation really reminded us that the housing crisis isn't just about the number of units we build, it's about the people, the communities, and the choices we make as a society. Your work certainly challenges us to think beyond the market, to protect what we already have, and to recognize that real solutions are already within our reach here in Canada. We're so grateful for your insights and for the work you're doing to push this conversation forward. Thank you so much, Brian, for being with us today.
Thank you, my pleasure. And if anyone wants to keep up to date with screenings across Canada, the easiest way to do that is just go to www.housingfilm.ca, and there's all sorts of information there. And if you want to get in touch to help organize one, that's the way to do it as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And that's a wrap. Today's episode featured Brian Doucet, whose research and public scholarship challenge us to think beyond market-driven solutions and toward more inclusive, sustainable housing systems. His work highlights the importance of non-market housing, protecting existing affordability, and recognizing the real human impacts of displacement and neighborhood change. Thank you for listening to On the Way Home, a podcast brought to you by Blue Door. Stay tuned for more conversations with leaders working to build stronger, more equitable housing futures.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host,